Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this closing session of the conference. I hope you join us feeling energized and inspired by everything you've heard over the last few days, and maybe also ready to feel a little bit challenged by a fantastic set of final panelists that we have for you today, who I'm sure are going to leave you with a lot of things to think about as you go back to your desks and carry on your roles. This is a slide-free session, so hopefully that is also a welcome break if you've been staring keenly at your screens. Maybe even an opportunity to sit back, close your eyes, and let our speakers transport you around the world as they talk about evaluation in the context of international climate change, and particularly how can we bring evaluation experience to bear in policy making and decision making for our policies and programmes. My name's Antonia Caldeira-Saraiva. I'm a Deputy Director in the International Climate and Energy team at BEIS, which is the UK government's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It's a hugely exciting time to be working in the international climate change space. And it's one in which we're quite lucky in some sectors and in some geographies. There's been quite a long history of evaluation being brought to bear on policy and programme design and also implementation. But we're very aware that's not always the case. There's still lots of work to do. So I think our speakers are going to tell us some of the lessons around what have we learned from this history so far about how to make evaluation work better for decision makers. How can we make it work better for more people in different contexts around the world? And also how can we sort of drive up appetite for good evaluation more widely? I'll be chairing the panel today, and we have a number of speakers who I'll introduce to you. They bring a huge array of experience from commissioning to designing, leading, and also appraising evaluation. So lots of different angles to bring to you today. Our first speaker is Mel Slade. Mel is going to start us off by kind of setting the context really around the climate challenge. Where are we now and what do we still have to do? And in particular, Mel's going to talk about the progress she feels policymakers really need to make in understanding the social dimensions of the clean energy transitions that we're going through, and how we can have a much better understanding of the differential impacts that policies can have on people of different genders, ages, and other characteristics. So Mel's career has been in energy efficiency. She's worked in and for and with many different governments around the world. That includes UK government, and Australia, New Zealand, China. She currently works at the International Energy Agency, where she is leading the Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies programme. And that involves working with policymakers in countries such as Brazil, China, Indonesia, Mexico, Thailand, and others. So thank you very much, Mel. We really look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Antonia, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So as you've heard from that introduction, I'm not an evaluator, but I regularly work with evaluators to track policy impacts and help governments design more effective policies. And I'm actually here today to ask for your help. But to start with, of course, the closing plenary of these events is always about challenges, and no IEA presentation is complete without starting with the big picture of where we are today, where we need to be if we're going to meet our climate goals. There's much talk about net zero emissions by 2050, but we have an awful long way to go to reduce the trend in rising emissions. In particular, in December 2020, for example, emissions were already higher than they had been in December 2019 before the health crisis hit us, and that might not be evident to everybody. So we need to act quickly to deploy all cost-effective clean energy technologies we have available today if we're not going to continue to lock in high levels of emissions for the future and make the 2050 goals unattainable and unaffordable. And this really does have to start now. The single largest area of action needed if we're going to reduce emissions while at the same time providing a secure, affordable, sustainable energy system for all is energy efficiency, and that's closely followed, of course, by renewables. And as discussed earlier in the earlier session, when you were talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, When they were established back in 2015, of course, the target for energy efficiency or energy intensity improvement was a rate of 2% a year. We managed that momentarily, well, perhaps for a couple of years, but unfortunately it slowed down, and we're now faced with a target which is probably double that. So how do we help governments scale up action on energy efficiency to accelerate the rate of progress? To achieve that, we believe we need very forceful and effective policies to put in place by governments, because without this, we don't see those changes in energy intensity improvement that we need. It's certainly not something the market does by itself at anywhere near a sufficient pace. And this is particularly important in the large emerging economies who have so many pressures to grow their economies and improve the lives of their citizens. So particularly in times of crisis as we are now, it's very difficult sometimes for energy efficiency to get a look in. Even the officials who are involved in policy development and know what the benefits are that it can bring can struggle to get this point across when really big decisions are being made and public funding is being allocated through very competitive processes. So we're often asked for help with making the case for energy efficiency in a way that it will resonate not with the energy efficiency community, but with finance ministers, with our prime ministers, with our presidents. And the motivation varies from country to country. And this is where, of course, you all have heard the IEA often talk about the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. So just to take a couple of examples, there's been tremendous success in India, for example, both in renewables and in energy efficiency. And this has been driven primarily through concerns about energy security, and in particular, the costs of importing oil. In China, as a contrast, the success there has been driven by the desire to, or the need to, reduce local air pollution. So in those cases, evaluations need to be designed to provide evidence for those specific benefits to help craft effective policies and make sure they're well-resourced and well-implemented. So there's a role in design and in the tracking to really prove the case. But now, of course, where with what the world is facing, the priorities are economic growth and jobs. And this applies not just to energy efficiency, of course, but to clean energy transitions across the board. And so we've started tracking progress of, or tracking sustainable recovery plans. And in particular, the jobs created by investments in energy. And it is a challenge, as you will all know, to establish those jobs impacts. And there are people working on this around the world. Some countries have got good at this, but to be honest, they're few and far between, and they're using resources, the level of resources that are not going to be available in the emerging economies. So I think one challenge is to work collaboratively to come up with fit-for-purpose methodologies that can be used to track jobs created by clean energy transitions credibly. And of course, credibly is the important word there. So IEA analysis last year showed that energy efficiency, particularly in buildings, was the most cost-effective way of creating good quality local jobs, and the locals are a really important factor here, at about 15 jobs per $1 million invested, followed closely by solar at about 12. Now, this is a great starting point, but it's not all that as simple as all that. And in terms of clean energy transitions, not all jobs are created equal. As we move away from fossil fuels, people whose livelihoods have depended on them are, of course, at risk. And while, as we said, many jobs can be created, they're not always accessible to the people losing their jobs. So, for example, there are 7 million coal miners in the world, and more people employed in the supply chain. And these people need to be part of the solution. You know, a government that has 100,000 coal miners today and anticipates 400,000 clean energy jobs in the future will still not be without its challenges. And there's more and more recognition that without people on board, clean energy transitions won't be successful. You only have to look at what happened here in France. With the impact of the Gilets jaunes on the French economy in 2018 and early 19. And they were campaigning against a fuel tax that was being implemented as part of the climate policy package. But as the French government is the first to admit, people were not brought along with the development of that decision. So For clean energy transitions to be successful, they have to be carefully planned. The existing workforce needs to be included. The 50% of people on the planet who are women need to be part of the solution. The 50% of the people on the planet who are under 30 years old need to be part of the solution, and as do other disadvantaged groups. So we need to work with the evaluation community, with you all, to come up with methodologies for assessing changes in employment that take into account those subtleties. It's not just two numbers, gains, losses. And this will help design policies, the policies that we need to ensure fair clean energy transitions. The IEA has just launched a commission on people-centred transitions under the leadership of the governments of Denmark, Senegal, and our executive director. Timely, the commission had its first meeting yesterday, and it was attended by ministers and thought leaders from across the world. And they were, of course, all calling for fair and inclusive transitions, but it was interesting to see how that differed from country to country, from developing to more advanced economies. And so we have to come up with a process that's really, really subtle and nuanced in order to be able to be successful here. One of the things that came up, everybody would be very pleased to hear, was the need for robust metrics to be able to design, implement, track. Finance also came up, as that won't be surprising. And so as well, in terms of developing in emerging economies, as well as supporting governments, we also need to encourage funders, including the development banks, to build more sophisticated evaluation in from the start, to make sure data is collected along the way. And I wonder if perhaps, as a challenge as well, could there be a general rule that this is always done in partnership with local evaluators so that capacity building can be integrated from the start? Because while this is well known and understood, it's not very necessarily well done, but building a local evaluation community will support the rollout of effective policy for years to come. We need to support governments in being able to do these things when they want to do them with their own resources. So from the perspective of an advisor on policy, my challenge to the evaluation community is to support people-centred clean energy transitions, to make sure people's needs are taken into account, because without that, these transitions will not be successful. We will not meet our climate goals. And so my final plea is that you share your data and your evaluation experience on these issues with us. We'd be delighted to build on them, work with you, use them as evidence to support policymakers through this challenging but very much essential journey. And with that, I'll end. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mel. Already a lot of food for thought in that opening session that you've given us. I mean, as an evaluator myself, I think particularly that challenge you laid about how can we really effectively and in a nuanced way collect and track sort of attributes like job creation, but also all the other types of outcomes and impacts we're looking at in our policy evaluations, and how can we really understand how they differentiate across different groups of people rather than being too blunt an instrument. So yeah, look forward to talking about that more with you later on in this session, and hopefully people in our audience are thinking about that for themselves already. We're now going to hear from Joe Dickman. Joe is going to speak to us a bit about some of his real life examples or real world examples of where evaluation has been brought to bear on informing and influencing policy and programme design and implementation. So Joe joins us from the Climate Investment Fund's Evaluation and Learning Initiative, which he leads. That covers a really large portfolio of activities. It's climate finance, but also clean energy, energy access, sustainable forestry, and climate resilience. So lots of different applications for us to hear about from Joe. He also has experience prior to the CIF in working within the MasterCard Foundation and also Care International. So lots of different perspectives about how you can bring evaluation to bear in those different contexts. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Antonia, and good to be here with all of you. I guess overall, I would say that evaluation evidence can play a very crucial role in informing policy, but we need to perhaps think a little bit differently on how we deploy it. And I'll share a few examples and thoughts about this. As Antonia mentioned, the Climate Investment Funds, or the CIF, we're a large multi-stakeholder climate financing platform And we developed and oriented the Evaluation and Learning Initiative, which the UK helped to create, around the partners and stakeholders of the CIF. And so this includes 6 major multilateral development banks, 72 developing countries, 14 contributor countries, and several others. And so we've been also trying to do this at the nexus of evaluation and learning, so that the learning is used to improve future investments, not just for the CIF, but for the broader climate finance sector. And this is actually explicitly built in as a core mandate of the function. And I think this has led us to commission a range of different types of studies with a particular focus on thematic evaluations that have played a role in influencing the policies and investments of our partners and of others. Just a few quick examples. We did large evaluations of the CIF delivery model, which we call the programmatic approach, which is the country investment planning process that the CIF undertakes, as well as evaluations of the extent to which CIF contributed to transformational changes in countries. And these evaluations help shape how countries and multilaterals and others think about these concepts. So for example, the UK has built in how we define and assess transformational change into their guidance across international climate finance programs. The NAMA facility, another climate fund, also adopted aspects of this framework. And the UK's Independent Commission on Aid Impact found that these evaluations had influenced global learning and practice in the sector. They also informed CIF's future. So this work was cited in, for example, UK parliamentary committees on climate finance, in policy memos informing the new US administration and a number of European governments. They were also referenced in a letter signed by ministers from over 50 developing countries that urged continued support for climate financing. And it's now informing a new set of CIF programs with explicit new project investment criteria on specific areas of transformational change and just transitions, building on our past evaluations. We also did a study on how climate finance can support COVID-19 recoveries and have used these learnings to design a new financing window that helps the development banks and countries with technical assistance to build in green policies and investments as part of COVID-19 recovery lending. And this is incredibly crucial, particularly looking at how these investments can influence jobs, a broader economic growth, and support the most vulnerable in an equitable way, as Mel was noting in her comments. And at the level of the implementing institutions, the multilateral development banks, we've had commissioned studies that looked at more specific thematic areas, including, for example, leveraging private sector investment in energy, clean energy and forestry, or supporting improved water governance, or rooftop solar in India. And these more specific studies looked at the respective strategies and policies in both MDVs and countries with an eye towards ramping up ambition and effectiveness, and in some cases actually resulted in new financing facilities that spurred more investment in these areas. And then at the country level, we know that governments have also used some of these analyses and data to advocate for climate priorities. In Zambia, for example, we held a workshop on the transformational change findings with ministers and parliamentarians, and they used these findings and lessons to help solidify support for the new National Climate Action Plan and scaling up new climate resilience investments. And in fact, on the closing day of the workshop, the government of Zambia signed a new $100 million loan with the World Bank to scale up climate resilience investments in the north of the country and mainstream resilience across government institutions. Currently, we have ongoing studies on the topics of just transitions, studies that are looking more deeply at the socio-economic development impacts and the distributional impacts of clean energy projects and investments, and low carbon energy access in low-income countries. And these are also designed with the needs of countries and banks in mind, and are therefore well positioned to support more ambitious climate policies going forward. And so a couple of thoughts on how evaluation can perhaps change tack somewhat to be more effective in informing policy. The first, I think, is evaluation initiatives or units or offices within institutions that have a clear learning mandate and an explicit goal to inform not just the institution that it serves, but also the wider sector. This can help orient evaluations to respond to the needs of a wider set of actors and address persisting challenges within the systems and therefore increase the likelihood of use. I think continuing to focus more on thematic evaluations. So we're not just evaluating a program or a project in isolation, but rather a pressing theme or challenge or barrier to change across programs and projects. And this way, I think evaluations can have more likely to have relevance beyond the institution or the program that it's evaluating. I think because SIP is a large platform, in part, we've been able to do that. But I think within the broader field, perhaps more joint or multi-agency evaluation and collaboration on key themes would help with this. And then finally, I think we can do a better job of incorporating systems thinking into evaluation and evaluating the broader impacts or factors beyond a project's boundaries or direct control, but that ultimately influence the types of sustainable changes that we're looking to create with these interventions. And I think we've done that in the transformational change evaluation that we did and some of the conceptual work around that. I think the new DAC international evaluation criteria is a step in the right direction, and initiatives like Blue Marble evaluation that Michael Quinn-Patton is leading are also a really good step. But we can do more, and collectively as an evaluation community, think more at the systems level so that our evaluations are more likely to help influence policies. I'll stop there for now, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really great examples there of evaluation evidence really actually being kind of brought into decision-making forums. You talked about parliamentary committees and programs in other parts of the world that are learning from others. So yeah, later on it'd be great to get some more sort of thoughts from you on, you know, how does that happen? What makes that successful? And how do we elevate the learning that we each kind of generate in our own little portions of this community and share them more widely? Joe and Mel, we're going to have a discussion as a panel now. And the first question, sorry, before I go on, I'll just mention to the audience, we're going to have a few questions that we're going to discuss together, which we hope you find interesting. But we'd love to get some questions from you as well. Please do go to the live Q&A section of this conference portal and post any questions that you have for our panelists, and we'll take those in a few moments' time. Thank you. But yeah, just to kick us off, Joe, I was really interested. One of the things you mentioned was the value that you feel thematic evaluations can have. So when you kind of raise the types of questions and the focus that you have above the level of one specific program to try and generate learning that might be more widely valuable and applicable. I'd love to get your thoughts and Mel's thoughts on, you know, if you were able to right now fund some big joint thematic evaluation, what are the key themes that you think are kind of most pertinent at the moment, under-evaluated at the moment? Where would you like that sort of that energy to go?
Thank you. Well, I think Mel hit it on the spot, really. In this age, in the COVID-19 context, and you know, countries and economies, people are really hurting right now, and so, you know, any investment in clean energy transition has to really make a case that it's going to improve lives and jobs. You know, country finances are struggling, so there has to be a case on the macroeconomics and at the people level. And so, you know, one of the main new activities we've been embarking on over the last year is what we are calling the Just Transitions Initiative, where we've commissioned a set of case studies, conceptual work, tools and resources, a library of examples. Because if you look at, you know, aligning with the Paris Agreement, which a lot of the development banks and countries are trying to do in their policies, and you look at where, you know, where have we had stumbling blocks or lack of progress around that, and then we go to this current context where people are struggling and economies are struggling. Again, this is an area where I believe the banks and the policymakers need support. They need data, they need evidence, lessons, tools. Where can this work well? How can investments be designed to ensure a just and smooth transition that doesn't leave anyone behind? And it requires thinking very differently. Frankly, the energy sector is used to thinking a little bit more technically and around technology, financing. Perhaps we need to think a little bit more holistically and look at the socioeconomic impacts, the co-benefits, the equity dimensions of all of this. So in addition to the just transitions work, we're also commissioning new evaluations that look in a mixed methods way at some of the socioeconomic and distributional impacts of these investments. I think that's a critical area that is still underdeveloped and could use broader cross-agency collaboration in evaluating.
Absolutely. Mel, was there anything else you want to say on kind of the key themes that you see as kind of coming to the fore in the evaluation community at the moment?
Well, yes, you won't be surprised that my number one is the jobs, but it's as you mentioned, it's the nuanced jobs, because these things just don't affect everybody in the same way. Even within an individual community, you can have situations where energy efficiency programs, access programs, impact differently on different people. Access has different impacts on women to many men in many communities, particularly the rural communities that are seeing the benefits of having electricity, for example, for the first time. One of the other things that I think is important is the energy efficiency within the access context. And it's not often talked about. I mean, I know that the UK has some great work on this, but it's not that commonly looked at, and so I'd like to see that done more across the board, and so that you'd have to have these much more complex evaluation where you look at who gains and what are the detailed bits of policy design that you need to make these things more effective and more inclusive for everybody. Yeah, I'd leave it at that. I think Joseph said it all.
A moment, Mel's talked a lot about this real need for the evaluation community to help kind of step up and support policymakers in capturing really good data and metrics on the differential impact of policies and programs. I just wondered if you had any experience or learning from SIF around how you're doing that at the moment, or any future thinking you've got about how you might adjust some of your approaches and methodologies to make sure that we are kind of looking at fair and inclusive collection of data.
No, it's a great point. Certainly, in whether it's sampling or thinking about stakeholder views that go into evaluations, making sure that we have a broad and representative sample, and thinking perhaps beyond those who are just directly involved in the project, but those who are experiencing the project, perhaps indirectly, or those that aren't frankly experiencing the project, but perhaps should be. So just thinking a little bit differently and creatively. And again, we've tried to do that in different evaluations, but I think we can do more of it going forward. And part of it, and this gets back to the demand and the use side, I think, is just ensuring that we're consulting the right stakeholders at the very beginning. One of the things that I think benefits the SIF, we have civil society observers in the governance committees. So there are leads on, for example, gender or indigenous peoples or other thematic areas, energy access, and we involve them in stakeholder groups, reference groups, learning partnerships in designing the evaluations and implementing the evaluations. And I think that brings a really important perspective that can then trickle out through the data collection and ensure that you're looking at the areas that we need to look at.
Absolutely. And Mel, maybe pointing to you again now. So do you have any other advice for our audience on how we can make sure that evaluations are designed, conducted, disseminated in ways that really work for emerging economies?
Just one point to follow up on what Joseph just said. One of the tricky things, it's always been a tricky thing with energy efficiency, where we're often working off a kind of a counterfactual, something that didn't happen. We have that potentially with this jobs issue as well. So it's easy to see where job losses are going to be in terms of the fossil fuel industries, for example. It's easy to work out what the people under 30, the people who need the next generation of jobs. You can't really. It's more difficult to assess how things are for them at the moment. It's much more what do we need to create? What education is necessary? But you can't observe that group and make the same sort of draw conclusions in the same way as you can with the kind of incumbents. So it's just a point. It's not just about gender and disadvantaged groups. There's more subtlety to the skills issue, I suppose, than there's also the geographical thing. Where are these things happening? Because they're not necessarily happening in the same places, and there might be reasons why migration's not possible. So it's complicated. So in terms of the emerging economies, it's really tricky to get to be able to persuade emerging economy governments to spend resources on evaluation. Some of this I know has been talked about in other sessions, but there's a fear of what it's going to say and what that's going to mean to people. It depends on the culture, but sometimes it's difficult to to have an evaluation that's trying to point to the way forward without it being taken as critical as about what's happened. There are very subtle nuances here. So I suppose that's why I quite like the idea of the thematic evaluations that Joseph was talking about. I think it's much easier to pull together a lot of projects and programs and draw strong direction from that and sell that well than the necessarily nitpicking when you're doing an evaluation of something very specific, which can be pretty difficult for the people involved and the people who are paying the bill, to be honest. So it's if you're trying to encourage a culture of governments funding their own evaluation, that it's going to be very tricky to do it that way. So I think thematic's got to be the way to go.
Absolutely. And actually, this is a really good moment to bring in a third member of our panel who will join this discussion. I'll just introduce him first, and then we'll come back to this question around appetite and demand for evaluation. So hi, welcome, Professor Mizan Khan. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to have you. So for everyone in the audience, Professor Khan is Deputy Director at the International Centre for Climate Change and Development. He's also a lead author of the IPCC, very experienced in climate finance. There are so many of his achievements, it's hard to mention them all, but one I wanted to note is we're very lucky to have him as he has the recent title of Most Outstanding Professor, which was awarded by the World Education Congress. Professor Khan speaks at many universities as a visiting fellow around the world. And is published in all sorts of topics from climate change economics to politics to capacity building. And I know you bring particularly an experience of adaptation programs, which is a really interesting angle to add to this discussion. So thank you, Professor Khan, for joining us. Maybe I can start with you now in this discussion. We just were talking about some of the challenges that evaluations can face in terms of people being afraid of what they say, worried about taking up the evidence, feeling like threatened by what evaluation can offer. And I know you have a lot of experience of looking at evaluation and how it's brought into decision-making processes. So is there any of your experience you can share with us about how you think evaluation is best brought into good decision-making?
Yeah, thank you. Also, because of technical glitch, I had some difficulty initially to join, but thanks God that I could join. I'm a long-time researcher, and we do mostly. I'm the deputy director, as you mentioned, International Center for Climate Change and Development, and we do mostly policy-relevant research. Evidence base is extremely important, And As a citizen from a developing country, I can share that the demand side for evidence-based research is still not very strong. There is supply both from the national experts as well as international experts, and we are linked very well. So we have so many friends who can help us. So the supply side is very strong, but the demand side, not just in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, things are a little different now. The government now is very proactive in having evidence-based policy making. And the government of Bangladesh is very active in climate change policy and politics. Bangladesh is looked at kind of an adaptation capital, as Ban Ki-moon has dubbed the country as. So we look at in our research and policy making, ICAD strongly and very actively works with the government. We have many different agreements with many different ministries, including Foreign Ministry, Finance Ministry, External Resources Division, Planning Commission. And our approach is adaptation is learning by doing. This is what is our motto, because adaptation is kind of a new knowledge and practice with not many years, many decades of experience. So what we do, that we practice, for example, we apply a model. If it works, then we do based on action research. We are also very active in doing action research. We have graduate students who go to the field and then collect data and whether it works or not. That way, constantly there is a feedback loop of what is actually happening in the field and what the data, what the numbers say, what the effect is. So this is about one aspect. And for the last few years, we have been doing research on capacity building, for example. Because for the last 6 decades, starting from the 1960s, with the motto and slogan of institutional capacity building, there has been huge investments in the name of capacity building. But capacity building is kind of something, a very capacious framework, which does not give into very tight definition. It's extremely impervious. So both donors and the countries, recipients, also packaged many different types of projects in the name of capacity building, because it's non-political, it's non-controversial. But at the end of the day, not much capacity was built because it was mostly supply-driven, not demand-driven. So in 2018, we have published a book by Routledge, published one of our book. I'm the lead author. Dr. Salimul Haq is a co-author. Dr. Timmons Roberts, you might have heard about him also from Brown University, where I often visit. So we have reviewed the experiences of 6 agencies global, both multilateral and bilateral, as well as country experiences, CEDA, for example, FCDO now, USAID, all those. And there we have found that only NORAD, for example, invest in long-term capacity building. Capacity building is not a one-act discrete affair. It's a process. Okay. Earlier, the whole process was workshop-based, but not much left behind. So I'm a negotiator for the last 20 years, and UNFCCC has got its own framework of capacity building. And there has been several reviews, but still 12 or 13 agencies within the UNFCCC itself are involved in capacity building, not to talk of many, many other agencies. But so our main evidence base is that capacity building is a process. It needs to have a programmatic approach, at least 7 to 10 years of duration, and then we can have something to leave behind. It has to be demand-driven, led by national consultants who may not be super expert like globally reputed consultants, but those consultants should facilitate the whole process. The national experts must sit at the saddle, and international experts can facilitate. If that happens, then only capacity building will happen in a sustainable framework manner. And that is the reason we argue that universities should be the central hub of capacity building as the capacity builder. Because earlier practice, government officials always are transferred after 2 or maximum 3 years. and nothing is left. For example, I have been working under this negotiation process for long 20 years, and every 2-3 years, the secretary of the ministry changes, and he comes with a fresh brain, and we prepare him. By the time he starts speaking well as a good expert, then he's changed. So what we really need is kind of a university-focused capacity building process, both formal and informal, short course, semester-based training program, where all the stakeholders, including the government officials, come. So university can serve as a permanent, sustainable capacity breeder, in national sense. Thank you very much. I will come back later.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. There's such an interesting perspective. And I was just going to bring Jo in again here for another perspective. And Professor Khan, you've talked a little bit about the challenge of sort of driving up appetite for evaluation in a kind of context of the global south. And Jo, I know you have experience in public sector, private sector, kind of across that spectrum. Any other lessons you could bring to this discussion around how you can effectively drive up appetite for evaluation? What are the hooks? What kind of processes might we need to drive that forward?
I think Professor Khan is absolutely right in terms of the demand side not being as strong as we would all like to see, and Mel's earlier comments as well on this. And so, let's be honest here. I think evaluation came out of the old traditional international aid paradigm, and is still widely associated with this idea of donor-driven accountability evaluations, which rightly in a lot of cases isn't a very attractive prospect or proposition for country stakeholders and policymakers. And so I think to shift that, one thing it requires is simply involving government stakeholders at the table from the beginning, and other country level stakeholders in the design and the commissioning of the evaluation. So making sure that we're focusing on themes that matter to them, that they want to see evaluated, and then doing it in a way that helps them. I think another thing is, when we talk about these thematic evaluations, we do more traditional evaluations to meet other corporate needs of programs and projects. But for the thematic evaluations, we often don't call them an evaluation. We call it a learning review, or something a little bit less off-putting for stakeholders, so that they can engage and see that it's not about shaming or blaming or compliance to something, but rather just learning about the challenges, celebrating some of the successes, and pointing a way forward with the evidence base. I also think for private sector and energy sector, getting private sector engagement is so critically important. And whether it's private sector or the more technical energy experts, I think often people aren't used to seeing the value of evaluation in the daily work. And so we need to meet them where they are, speak their language, maybe not call it an evaluation. It could be a market assessment or something institutional review, something different. We commissioned Bloomberg New Energy Finance to do a study on the use of concessional finance in the Clean Technology Fund in the CIF. And it's a good example. In no way is it a traditional evaluation. It looked back at CIF investments in markets and how those may have stimulated different kinds of market growth. But then over half of the study was looking forward on market projections and pricing scenarios, tipping points when renewable energy becomes cost competitive in different markets. And that was the information that policymakers in countries and in the banks really valued and wanted us to do more of. So again, I think it's just about involving people throughout the process, thinking a little bit differently and tailoring to their needs.
Thank you, Jo, and I think that speaks really well. Actually, I've been looking at some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience, and someone had asked, how can we best present evaluation evidence to decision makers in a way that's most influential and easy to access? I think, as you've just spoken exactly to that point, it's about finding the right language. It's about finding a framing that appeals to them and kind of speaks to them. And to Mel's earlier presentation, it's about kind of looking for the right hooks, whether that be air pollution or job creation or economic growth. And really framing it in their own, in something that's pertinent to them. I'm just going to look at some of the other questions that have come in from the audience, and thank you so much to people for engaging in this really interesting debate. Someone has asked about the thematic evaluations and actually noted that, this is something that's cropped up several times over the course of this conference. A number of people have talked about the value of thematic approaches. And they would like to hear from the panel their views on who should be commissioning these thematic evaluations. So, for example, is this the responsibility of multilateral agencies and organisations, specialist organisations, or national organisations? Does anyone have a view on that? Mel.
May I come in?
Mel first, and then Professor Khan will come back to you. Thank you.
Okay.
So Professor Khan was my answer, really. So I think that we need, and it speaks across everything we've been talking about. We need national champions. We need in every country I've ever worked in, there's a go-to group of people where whoever that rotating government person that Professor Khan referred to, they always go to the same place for their advice on particular policy areas, and everybody knows who those people are. And they're the constant. And if those people can be convinced of how these sorts of evaluation, but particularly the thematic ones, as Joe talked about, the ones that point to where to go next, if those champions can be developed if champions can be developed in those local centres of excellence, then we'll start perhaps to win, because governments are more likely to be comfortable talking to those people. And believe them and not be so scared of them. And so I think, and Professor Khan's an example of just that. So there we go.
Professor Khan, please offer us your view on where these thematic evaluations should be commissioned from.
Okay. Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. In fact, from a strictly environmental perspective, themes cannot be so much isolated. You cannot have themes siloed, because environment is a kind of networked ware. So whatever we do, for example, has got its forward and backward linkages. Take the case of energy efficiency or energy conservation. This is a theme, though, but it's very cross-cutting. Once you tinker with one aspect, it affects other aspects. So we need to look at how a system, for example, energy system works from a wider perspective. For example, not just the technology itself, but the behavioral aspect surrounding the technology, to have the real evidence of how the technology works. This is the reason, for example, I have read World Bank in 2015. You also know this report, Mind and Body and Society, something they have come to terms that technology does not work independent itself of behavioral responses. So, for example, technology as a theme needs to be intertwined with behavioral responses. And defining technology now, we have to include the behavioral responses. Otherwise, for example, programmable thermostats, if you look at it, will not work effectively if also the behavioral responses are not attuned to that. So my understanding is that for evaluation, we need to have a broader macro perspective, not just typical narrow, siloed disciplinary perspective. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you very much. I'm just going to keep going through the Q&As to make sure we go through them. And there's a more specific question actually directed, Mel, at things you were saying around tracking job creation. And lots of people have upvoted this question, so it's of general interest. You've talked about how we need to avoid sort of just counting jobs gained against jobs lost, and not kind of having such a blunt instrument as that. So the question is, what else needs to be considered? For example, is it type of job? Is it geographical concentration of job? Is it skill level? And a second point to this, this participant feels that some jobs are more politically sensitive than others. People worry, for example, about coal miners losing their jobs, but not necessarily PV installers if a government support scheme is cut. So are high carbon jobs currently more highly valued, do you think?
So the first bit, it's all of those things. So it's the geography, it's the skills level, it's the diversity of the workforce. It's all of those things. To the second question, it's what I was trying to say was it's more about political sensitivity. So if we are expecting governments to drive through, net zero ambitions, clean energy transitions, they're not going to work if the people who are going to lose out aren't taken into account, wherever they may be, whatever they may be doing. So that was the point. So it's and there is generally there's a huge amount of optimism and enthusiasm about the amount of clean energy jobs that can be created. But there is, much less certainty and positivity about the fossil fuel industry jobs that are going to be lost. So it's not a question of valuing one over the other. It's that they all need to be taken into account. I was just trying to say that, 100,000 versus 400,000, you can't necessarily say that the 100,000 are going to gain from the 400,000. It depends where they are and what skills they need. So they're all valuable, but it's we're talking about things that will stop governments being able to push forward ambitious transitions if they don't bring people along with them. And Professor Khan's mentioned that as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And talking about bringing people along with us, someone else has asked all members of the panel, so to what extent do you see an interest in citizen organisations being involved in evaluations? An example has been given of potentially through participatory evaluations. So yeah, any kind of experience of using citizen organisations within evaluations and particularly participatory evaluations?
Maybe I could just start by saying that I think it's a really interesting concept, and we're seeing, clean energy transitions are being driven by digitalization, by the systems thinking, by the, complete change in approach in how we supply and use energy, and that's generating massive amount of data. So evaluation needs to develop with that, needs to be able to use those large amounts of data, and include, the ability to access information from millions of individuals, sort of participatory approaches. So it's got to be the way of the future. There, it's just a question of how and when, but it's not if.
Joe or Professor Khan, anything else to say on the bringing in of citizens within evaluation processes? Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, about this participatory evaluation, for example, this is a very interesting thing because this is kind of a slogan used by and also some development agencies. But what happens, on the ground, in not so democratic societies, participation is used for kind of a means for exclusion. So what we call is participatory exclusion, not really participatory designing or decision making, because the community members are invited, for example, by the NGO leaders or by the government officials. And what happens, just they attend for only head counts as the roll calls. But the decision in adaptation, for example, what really we need is really participatory designing and implementation, because adaptation is mostly local and regional specific. The role of the national government is to ensure just a facilitative environment for the whole adaptation programs and projects. But adaptation happens in specific locals, regions. And there the community knows best. The local government officials who served there for some years know best than the central government senior bureaucrats. But in not so democratic centralized societies, this is what is happening. So we need to change this paradigm, and the development partners are coming to terms, and that is why locally led adaptation now is being put on the higher pedestal as one of the 8 tracks under the Global Commission on Adaptation, And in ICAD, in our office, we are trying to do what is how to best operationalize this locally led adaptation, because here the central word is locally led. So how locals, including the local government officials and the community members, can lead the process. This is a gigantic challenge. So, but we hope to succeed based on this evidence-based action research and trial and error learning by doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, anything you want to say about your experience of participatory evaluation?
Well, Professor Khan's comments just triggered a reminder for me. The Zambia example that I spoke about in my opening comments, that's very much a bottom-up and top-down synergized approach to climate resilience. And the wider macro policies wouldn't have worked without the hard work on the ground and at the community level and with district development officers and district governments. And so involving them in the evaluation process, as we did in that workshop, that I think helped get the parliamentarians and the ministers to respond and see a locally led demand. So there can be massive benefits. And as Professor Khan says, climate adaptation ultimately is a local issue. They're the ones feeling it and needing to respond in their daily lives. Just another thing at a more macro level. One way to help bring these perspectives in, it's hard when you're running or commissioning a global evaluation to think and feasibly include multiple levels. One way we've tried to do it is through advisory groups or steering committees or reference groups of evaluations, where you at least have a few representatives within the wider committees that have some reach to those local levels or different levels of civil society. For example, our Just Transitions initiatives have people with the International Trade Unions Congress and some of their representatives. So you bring in diverse, different views, or the in-country work on just transition, whether it's case studies we did in South Africa or one coming out soon in India, really needing to value and bring in those other kinds of local groups or non-governmental groups that are so critical to the work on the ground.
Thank you. I'm just going to have one last question before we wrap up, and I'm going to ask each of the panel members just to give their one top tip in response to this question. So the final question is whether you have any advice on how evaluations can stay relevant to changing priorities. So if you just have one kind of top tip each on how to keep evaluations relevant as priorities change around them. Mel, do you want to go first?
Probably not. No, I think it's just to remember the things that will always matter to people. Politics come and go, and crises come and go, but so things like access, the sorts of multiple benefits of energy efficiency that affect economies, affect people's health. So making sure that those multiple benefits are always or the impacts of them are always accessible through the evaluation, even if they weren't perhaps the main purpose of it. Making sure that they can be synthesized from an evaluation process, because they'll always be in vogue.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Khan, one top tip for keeping an evaluation relevant in a changing context.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we need to work more with the governments to generate demands for evidence-based policymaking for led adaptation, because it is the local communities who are impacted the hardest. So if we talk of adaptation, they deserve your first call. So we need to work with the government as well as the local communities, but government is the all-powerful agency we cannot avoid. Thank you.
And Joe?
Yeah, for me, I would say staying agile and flexible to the changing circumstances and the debates around us, and meeting the moment, both what the demand is in the institutions, but also in the wider international context or the country level context. And that that means changing approaches or priority themes as we go and routinely doing that assessment and the realignment to stay relevant.
Well, thank you. Our time is up. That raced by, so it just leaves me to say a massive thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. I know Joe's joined us very early in the morning, so thank you for that, and hope you get off to have your breakfast now. It's been a really thought-provoking session and a great way to close the conference. I think the thing that's really struck me is just that evaluation is definitely not a product, it's a process, it's a conversation. And if we're going to make it kind of truly inclusive, whether that be of people or organizations or of the wider system in which it's taking place, then we need to be having kind of open and transparent conversations right from the beginning about how we design them, how we implement them, and how we disseminate our learning as well. As it's a closing session, I'll just kind of leave the audience with 3 key things to go away and sort of keep asking yourself and challenging yourself. So firstly, how can I, as an evaluator or a commissioner of evaluation, ensure I'm speaking the right language to bring people along the same journey with me? How can I identify their hooks and make sure that they are part of this? Secondly, how can I raise up the level of my evaluation work? How can I ensure the learning is of relevance beyond my own organisation, my own role, and is of benefit to the wider community? And lastly, what am I doing to really ensure the full range of impacts and the full range of differentiated impacts across different types of people is really being captured? And am I building that in effectively from the start? Hopefully that gives you something to think about, and thank you so much for joining us. I'll pass over now to the final closing words of the conference. Thank you. Or I think I will. We may have to fill in whilst we wait for the closing plenary to join us.
I think no, I think I'm here. Thank you, Antonia, and thank you for that panel. That was fascinating and excellent. It's my sad task to bring this to a close. It's been a fantastic event. Really interesting. Really impressed with how everyone sort of stepped up to the challenges of doing this online rather than in real life. I want to thank the speakers and the authors for sharing their interesting work, the keynote panelists who've inspired us to think bigger. I want to thank the sponsors, without whom we really couldn't have done this, and the planning committee, who've all given freely of their time and ideas and effort, which again is hugely appreciated. And of course, everybody who's attended, shared their questions, shared their thoughts, taken part in debates. Again, it needs everybody to come together to do something like this. And of course, lastly, I'd like to thank Expert Events, Leanne, Sarah, Lydia, and their colleagues who've, right into the middle of the night, kept the show on the road. So thank you to all of you. And then looking forward, well, I'm really hoping that in 2022 we're going to be able to meet in real life rather than online. I've been really lonely in the bar on my own in the evenings, so it'll be very nice to have some company. So there will be an event in 2022. Stay in touch by signing up to the mailing list, following us on social media to know what's going to happen. And if you'd like to take part in helping to organise that next event, then in the next final networking session, you'll have the option to join a group to talk about 2022. And everybody's really welcome to join that. Again, we need everybody's thoughts and ideas on that. There's 2 webinars coming up. I'm doing one tomorrow with BEIS and ITAD about mobilising climate finance, and a big thematic evaluation to pick up on one of the themes that came out of the closing plenary. And there's a webinar with the IEA next Thursday about their work on indicators and policies. The information on both of those is in the discussion forum and is on the energy evaluation website as well. And we're also looking for more trustees, and we'll be issuing a call for interest in that soon. And we would really love you to join us as trustees. And then the last thing I want to mention is where we started on the memorial for Kathleen, who really, so sadly isn't here delivering this these closing words. That in honour of Kathleen, we're going to have a memorial scholarship for early career evaluators. The first award will be next year, and there's details. Hopefully you can see them on screen, and they'll be on our website, on social media again. Follow us and sign up to our newsletter. And donations are still welcome. It's all the money virtually has come from individuals, friends and colleagues of Kathleen. So yeah, we're welcoming donations to that. On that note, please do join the next networking session to say goodbye or to talk about 2022. Thank you again for coming. Thank you again to everybody, and see you in 2022. Bye-bye.